Hello and welcome back to the second in the series of special podcasts discussing the Cox Automotive and Grant Thornton 2023-2024 Insight Report. Again, I'm Philip Nothard, Insight Director at Cox Automotive, and joining me again is Owen Edwards, Head of Downstream Automotive at Grant Thornton. In the second in the podcast series, again, we'll be discussing the topics and headlines in this year's Cox Automotive and Grant Thornton Insight Report that can be found on the Cox Automotive website. In this podcast, we'll be focusing on making sustainability more sustainable. So in Owen, we can't talk about making sustainability more sustainable without really focusing on the rise of EVs. We know that the global EV market is evolving, but there's several factors behind that growth of why it's happening, whether that's the ESG. There are reports that the EV and plug-in hybrid market, the PHEV market, could account for 20% of the global new car sales by the end of 2023 and 35% by the end of 2024. And that's a 35% increase on 2022. Do you think that's achievable? Do you think we're heading in that direction? And what are the factors behind some of this?
Yeah, so I suppose, is that achievable? I guess it will depend from brand to brand, in the sense of whether it's achievable or not. And at the end of the day, there will be some brands that are well in advance of others. There'll be some brands that are not well in advance of others, i.e. you're either dealing with hybrids now, but they don't have anything coming until 2027, 2028 in the way of BEVs. So it's going to be very varied across that. But I think what needs to be addressed for the manufacturers is really around that process of, if I don't meet those targets, there are consequences for me to have that. And it doesn't matter whether it's in China, it doesn't matter whether it's in the US, as we've discussed before, Europe or the UK. There is that inevitable, what am I going to do if I don't meet that? And therefore, the big question mark is, do I take the pain and the punishment on the fine, if there is a fine, depending on which mandate or legislation you deal with? Or is it, I drive, as some have quite obviously said, by 2030, will be pure 100% BEV.
And I mean, you make a point there, government policy and public opinion is crucial towards this transition to an EV market landscape, and whether we will achieve, a 35% increase in 2023 from 2022 in terms of that global EV sales. But I mean, one of the key markets in terms of, we've got China, Europe, US and even South Korea that are all playing a significant part of this International Energy Agency. And this is predicting that 40 million EVs will be on the road by the end of the year. I mean, is this realistic?
I mean, is it achievable? I mean, 40 million, if you look at the number of new vehicles manufactured a year, look at the production numbers, they're broadly around 70 to 80 million around there. So that's quite a substantial amount. So they've got to go something to do that in a way of 40 million, I would suggest, right? But, what we are seeing at the moment is we're seeing significant growth in the battery electric vehicle market in China, especially in China. That's the one that's growing. It's growing very rapidly. It's taking the biggest market share without a doubt. So could you see those sort of numbers, i.e. those sort of percentages of sort of mid to high double digits? You'll see them first probably in China, and that growth will come there. But then don't forget, it's all around that level of support as well that's been given to that particular market and the development of the battery technology in that market. What could potentially slow this down is if we are not evolving enough in the current legacy businesses, the currently legacy OEMs. That could not enable us to reach that 40 million or reach the 2035. So it's not a straightforward black and white. We will do it or we won't.
I mean, clearly, the EV market is on a rapid expansion. It underscores the crucial, pivotal role of this environmental shift. But what, in terms of the government regulations and the impact on this EV transition, we talk about manufacturers transitioning, but what about the consumer? Is there enough being done, do you think, from a consumer perspective in this transition to EV, or do you think, we should be doing a little bit more? Is it that different markets are at different stages in the transition to EV?
Yeah, so that's a really important point, because I think the consumer does play a big part in this. We've known all the way along that we have, the early adopter And I think we've got to that early adopter stage. We're now probably through that early adopter stage. We're now into the next stage of, the average Joe person in the street, buying their EV. However, it's absolutely critical that that EV is convenient to them. So does it have charging range anxiety, the consumer? What's the price of the vehicle? I think as we've seen with the likes of Tesla, as the price comes down, demand tends to go up, like most products out there, because at the moment, the price of these vehicles is too high. So fundamentally, if in order to meet those sort of requirements that we're sort of setting with the ZEV mandate, the Fit for 55, IRA in the States, and Standard 6, the issue that we're going to need there is we're going to actually need to have support by the government, which is what's taken place so far. So if you look at the big majority of where those vehicles are, they tend to be in, benefit in kind, or tend to be supported in one way or another. Norway, Germany, France, etc. And so therefore there does need to be that support. I would also suggest as well, there needs to be that support not just for the new end of the market, but there's also the potential that you need it for the used end of the market, as you're starting to see in Germany and France. It's only a token gesture, it's a small amount, but that small amount still makes a difference.
I mean, that's it, isn't it? I mean, we've seen this transition to EV. It's been driven, as you point out there, by the benefit in kind, very much in the fleet business sector. The private sector, the consumer, are not really transitioning as quickly as many manufacturers or many local governments would want. And part of that is the variances of that government support, the incentives, the tax benefits. There's different, you point out the IRA over in the US there's different incentives. The UK government, very little, if anything, to support the UK transition to a used battery electric vehicle, and very little, if anything, for the private individual, private driver to transition to EV. But you make the point there, we talk about this 2035 deadline, whether it's 2030, whether it's 2035, the ZEV mandate is really driving this transition.
Absolutely.
And whether there's incentives there for the consumer, it's about choice and availability of product, which will continually become limited.
Correct, and it's around the level of supply. So if you look at the very interesting point around, let's take what Richie Sunak did a couple of weeks back, moving from 2030 to 2035, taking petrol engines, saying right, petrol and diesel, you can run the internal combustion engine right up to 2035. Okay, the big issue is by the time you reach 2030 anyway, the ZEV mandate for cars is 80% BEV. So that leaves you with approximately 20%, well, it does leave you actually 20% thereafter, but that's about 460,000 vehicles in a 2.3 million market. So it's not a massive number of vehicles that you're now spreading over probably a very small proportion of diesel, but petrol and now hybrid, where previously it was 100% hybrid. So the scenario is that the manufacturers are now going to have to adapt and develop what they're building, which again means how much supply is available for the consumer to actually take, because it now might be spread across petrol, diesel and hybrid, where previously it would have just been spread across hybrid for the consumer. So that's a sort of different dynamic in the market now than what there was.
I mean, clearly, that as we are today going into 2024, the general feeling in this drive towards whatever deadline that is, whether it's 2030, 35, 2040 in some markets, 2050 in other markets, there needs to be more done to get the market shifting and transitioning to the ownership of battery electric vehicles, whether that's new or used, at the same time as the infrastructure develops and increases at the same time. Correct. Alongside battery development and manufacturing development. And I mean, we talk about battery electric vehicles and manufacturers and the process that this is going down in terms of making battery electric vehicles more sustainable. What are the alternatives? We're down this road of battery electric vehicles, but that is not the only choice of alternative fuels that are in the marketplace.
No, it's not. So there is still a reasonable selection of other different types of fuels that you'd have. So, I mean, for example, battery electric, we believe, and it's just a belief that we've got at GT, we believe, the battery electric vehicle is going to be more around for the passenger car. Okay, it's an area of the market that can handle that. It's a destination that you can charge up so you can charge up at home, drive to a destination, charge up there, drive back. So it's quite convenient to do that. Okay. However, if you're starting to look at the absolute hydrogen, for example, you're looking at probably more for the heavy goods end of the vehicle market. Now, the reason you're looking for that is because the trucks have what we call a dwell time, i.e. if it's a battery electric vehicle, it's out of action, lack of utilization for quite some time. Okay, so there are positions in the markets where hydrogen will be valuable. There's positions where battery will be significantly valuable. But then at the other end of the aspect, you've also got e-fuels. So if you look at Porsche and Ferrari, they're looking very much at like biofuels and e-fuels and how they can, be used. Now, the issue with those is clearly, as you've got with a hydrogen industrial internal combustion engine, is that does emit CO2 emissions as well. So once you take that out, you're still net zero, but you have to consider that. But the problem with those type of scenarios of the biofuels and the e-fuels is they are jolly expensive to manufacture. So unless that price can be brought down, then we're going to be in a situation where that will only be for maybe the selected few.
And I mean, talking manufacturing there, and this is as much about that raw material. We're talking the report about sustainable practices for the direct lithium extraction.
Yeah.
We talk about that renewable energy usage, we talk about waste reduction, and that whole circular material sourcing. How is this battery production in the early days would be questioned how sustainable it actually was
absolutely.
as a BEV marketplace.
Yeah, and we've seen that with the raw materials that are coming out. So nickel, magnesium, cobalt, etc. Some of them are so rare it's quite unreal, and the way they're extracted from the earth as well is not environmentally friendly, nor is it friendly towards human beings as well. Which you've seen in some countries in Africa, for example. So the scenario is that what we need to do is we need to make that whole unit more sustainable. Now, two things will drive that. One is the actual legislation around it, so ESG, etc., etc. But the other factor that will do that is it is becoming more difficult to extract from the mine. It is taking up to 10 years to plan for it. What, however, will now have a factor is that you will now sit there and have to recycle batteries, which is a common circular economy reference you were talking about. So these batteries will come back out of the useful life of them in an EV, come back into the system again and recycle themselves around again.
I mean, this is it, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned e-fuels, you mentioned hydrogen as two alternatives to the BEV market, battery electric vehicle market. But again, production efficiency is going to be challenging for that to make e-fuels affordable and cost effective.
Correct, yeah.
But hydrogen, you're into the space of infrastructure challenges.
Correct.
We already know with the battery electric vehicle market, there are challenges in infrastructure in some markets today.
Yep.
And where that looks going out to sort of 2030, 2035 in the long term. But hydrogen is nowhere near where battery electric vehicle is.
It's absolutely correct. It's not. You're absolutely right. And that's why we still believe battery will be the dominant force especially in passenger cars and probably a large number of the light commercial vehicles and also a large portion of the trucks. There will be those heavy rooted HGV trucks that might go to hydrogen. You're absolutely right. That infrastructure is not in place at the current moment in time. It needs to be. It costs a lot at the moment. Costs need to come down.
I mean, the manufacturers are clearly working on that sustainable marketplace.
Yep.
They're clearly looking at, exploration or potential alternatives to make it affordable, to make the process more efficient.
Correct, yeah.
But this is, all about reducing that environmental impact to that sort of decarbonisation that we're talking about. And this is the bigger picture in the global market that we're looking at from a manufacturer perspective.
Yeah, and what the manufacturers have openly came out and said, right, well, what we're going to do is we're going to reduce our CO2 emissions. We're going to go net zero by, and they're all out there, Volvo, Ford, etc. by X amount of time. Some are saying 2040, some are saying 2050, when we're going to go net zero. So I think that, without a doubt, there's always that sort of, environmentally conscious position that they need to keep and have, because, the other aspect is when you've got zero tailpipe emissions, that's fine. You're no longer in that position of having a problem with tailpipe emissions. You've then got to look at the supply chain that goes with that and the distribution chain that goes with that as well. So it's a combination of both.
So supply chains within that whole sustainability, more sustainable. We mentioned it previously about supply chain being crucial to the battery electric vehicle marketplace and this move to sustainability. How is the complexity and globalization of this playing out in terms of that supply chain? We saw what happens when the supply chain breaks through the pandemic
Yeah.
and what that did to the manufacturers. And now we're moving into electronic components becoming more sophisticated in the market.
Yep.
EV production is more sophisticated along that whole supply chain strategies. Are we potentially heading towards another shift in that whole relationship between the manufacturers, the OEMs, and their suppliers in that whole tier 1 to 4 supply chain?
Yeah, I think we are. So to sort of answer that question, Phil, is if you look back, it was all about in the 1980s. It was all about outsourcing. It was all about lean. How can I make my production process much better? Is it a sense I outsource it? I take it offshore, what we call offshoring, right? Okay. So with that scenario, the manufacturer is there sort of passing that out to third-party joint ventures, partnerships, whatever the case may be. What's becoming more inherently interesting over the last 12, 24 months, and what's happening actually due to BVs driving it, is you're seeing more around the scenario of vertical integration. So more and more, the manufacturers are now looking at this and saying, well, actually, do I just want to be in this particular space of being a assembler of vehicles? Or do I actually want to be much more broader than that? And that applies to the supply chain and to the distribution chain. So, what you are seeing, say, for example, is BYD, 75% of their supply chain is owned by them. It gives them consistency, margin, improved profitability, added value, yeah? And then at the other extremes, I know we're talking about supply chain, but right at the other extremes, you've got the likes of the battery charging people. The OEMs are getting involved in that as well. So they're bringing this vertical integration across the whole of the industry. But supply chain, you're absolutely right, it is changing and shifting.
I mean, just to put context behind that, the reports are that the average vehicle has 25,000 parts, of which the OEMs, away from BYD, owning 75% of that, and heavily, purely, mainly reliant on glass and rubber as their supply chain, external supply chain. Exactly. Everything else is self-built and self-supplied. But what they are vulnerable if they don't get it right. Clearly vulnerable. That was proven through the pandemic, through COVID. The OEMs are they're open to the challenges of this, and as they become more reliant on technology, EV, that technical space, they are competing with a lot of other marketplaces, particularly in that consumer electricals market, for that same supply chain.
Yeah, they are, and that's what we saw in COVID. So when COVID took place, it was a scenario, as that the manufacturers had a just-in-time process. Now, when we say just-in-time, it is literally, it's probably the most sophisticated just-in-time process in the world. You were looking at the likes of, say, Honda, for example, having only a couple of hours worth of inventory sitting there. So it's really advanced, really technical. But what we are slowly starting to see through. Could be even as much as changes due to Brexit, for example, with tariffs and getting products through, for example. That's one example. COVID was another example, with the semiconductors. As soon as they lost that just-in-time process, the system sort of broke down. Hence the reason, not fully broke down, but broke down, but hence the reason that you've seen now, that shortage in supply in 2022. We got over COVID, but we hadn't got over the supply chain issue.
So, I mean, we're talking there that the automotive sector, the suppliers, the manufacturers are having to adapt, evolve to the new growing complexity in the global space, competitive marketplaces around suppliers, you touched on earlier, having to invest in integration, vertical integration, buy in supply chains out so that they're not working on that just in time. But I think, moving forward, you touched on, we talked about it there, but how are they enhancing this resilience? I mean, they can't all go out and buy the supply chain businesses.
No, you can't.
Some of them will have to remain reliant on tier 1 to tier 4 suppliers.
Yeah, by no means. I mean, by no means are the tier 1 to 4 suppliers dead. That's not what we're saying here. What we're saying is actually some of those tier 1 could actually start to become manufacturers themselves. So some of the new American brands that are out there, are actually like Fisker, for example, are actually having their businesses, their products manufactured by tier 1s that are now manufacturing companies, are assemblers. So I think it's just really an evolving market, and what the tier 1 to tier 4 supply chain is doing is also evolving at a rapid rate. that is developing in itself. They are starting to become, more concentrated and vertically integrated themselves. So we are seeing it across the board. It's not just the OEMs. Will we have 100% manufacturing by one OEM? No, that's not what we're going to see. Are we going to see increased vertical integration? Yes, it's very likely, but not just a complete end-to-end 100%. No.
I mean, we touched on the pandemic, COVID-19, but there are other things like the conflict in Ukraine that hit the supply chain. The manufacturers had no control over that at all. The Suez Canal issue that again caused a problem. There are certain external factors that the OEMs can't control, and like the UAW in the US, where you have the strikes and that again, it's costs. Those Detroit 3, that when the UAW went on strike, they had to shut down other factories to slow down the profit leakage that was happening. So the manufacturers can't control all of that supply chain.
No, they can't, and they and they never will. They never will be 100% controlling your supply chain. Right from the dawn of time, whether you take the Ford Model T or whatever, they had a big chunk of the vertical integration, but they never actually fully controlled the whole thing, because you just can't do it. However, what I would say is, the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on and so forth is swung the other way. So it's just pendulum between these two factors of, how far do I go down the vertical integration?
But it is clear from all of this, supply chain resilience is a key priority for the manufacturers in adopting those future strategies.
Correct.
Absolutely crucial to the profitability of those manufacturers moving forward. I mean, returning to sustainability and thinking about, ethical raw material, thinking about transparency of where that material is sourced from, where is this becoming? I mean, it's a central consideration now in that automotive supply chain management around how ethical this supply raw material is now, in particular the battery electric vehicle market, because of cobalt, lithium, and all these raw materials.
Yeah, and the manufacturers can't be seen not to be ethical in that manner. So, we're starting to see many of the manufacturers who are now putting battery passports onto certain different types of raw materials to ensure that they're coming from ethically sourced areas of the world. So that's one area. You then got CO2 emissions, and what's happening with the CO2 emissions and what they would have to regulatory, build for their reporting process, both for financial, and that's TCFDs. I always get that wrong way around, so my apologies. But that they will have to do that as well. So, and you've got the CBAMs as well, which is the carbon emissions. So all of this regulation is also being overlaid on what they're trying to do as well. So there's also legislation that's pushing them towards that ESG agenda.
I mean, that's it. We talk a lot about local challenges, we talk about local infrastructure issues, we talk about supply chain, but overarching all of this is that ESG, that environmental, social, and corporate governance that they have to adhere to. As you say, you've got your task force on climate control, financial disclosure starting to clearly the manufacturers have got to adhere to all of this. If not, they face significant fines and potential loss of business, because everybody's wanting, they're wanting to do deals and business with people that are achieving these ESG standards.
Yeah. And put it this way, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy accounting for, every CO2 being emitted. It's not going to be easy for every single pipeline to be actually, analysed in a great amount of detail. So that's something that needs to be thought about really, really carefully, and that's really around that ESG agenda and what's happening around ESG and how that process is being developed, because it's going to be a lengthy process.
And there's others we know there's ones for EU with their carbon adjustment. There's one in Germany in terms of their supply chain due diligence that's taking place in Germany. So there's a lot for these manufacturers in different markets, different dynamics, different standards that they have to adhere to produce vehicles either for import or export out of certain countries.
Yeah. And we're seeing that personally ourselves at GT, where we're actually now having to comply to specific manufacturers' requirements as well. So not only is there that legislation that you're talking about, which is by the bigger entity, the macro picture, but it's also now the micro picture, which is the individual companies themselves that are now saying, we need to have this, we need to have that, you have to, give us the CO2 emissions, etc.
And that's it. I mean, just to finish off on this point, that you start, as I said earlier, you look at local levels and ZEV mandates and 2030 to 2035 in the UK, but clearly the manufacturers have to work towards that sustainability, considering that's now potentially shaping the future landscape of the automotive sector, right from that high level of achieving those ESG standards.
Yep.
So within making sustainability more sustainable, battery life, health, real world lessons learned. So let's bring this a little bit down now, where we are today, what's happening in that space. Batteries are clearly evolving, but what is the implications for manufacturers around the maintenance of these batteries and how it's starting to change? Because in your combustion engine, you got your engine block, improved slightly better brake horsepower, slightly better efficiency, etc., etc. But the battery market, it's new technology, it's changing. Old technology, now new technology. It's not a development of a battery, it's new battery technology. How is this now starting to evolve in the marketplace, and what is the impact on the materials and that repairability of the battery electric vehicle marketplace?
So that's a massive topic in itself across all those areas. So let's try and take some of them. So in the way of battery health, I mean, clearly one of the things that we're all concerned about is degradation of the battery, i.e. like with your mobile phone, after 2 years you have to keep plugging it in every so often, because the battery, although it says 100%, is not necessarily at 100% charge. So the scenario you've got there is the battery degradation, and determining that battery degradation and the battery health is a difficult thing to do. We've got tests at the moment, but they're not extensive tests to actually determine what is truly damaged within that battery. Then there's the battery itself at the moment. The scenario is if the battery is damaged at the precise moment in time, it is more likely that you'll write the battery off. It does change a little bit from battery to battery, but increasingly what will happen down the line is you'll be able to open up the batteries and then improve that in the way of the batteries. Also, there is a potential as well for changing the battery in the car. Although at the current moment in time, unless you're swapping the battery out like a Neo, that's not really heard of. You might do it for warranty, but you won't be doing it on a regular basis unless, like I say, it's for a Neo. So the battery health is absolutely critical, both for the new car market, but also as well for the used car market, because clearly the consumer in the used car market needs to feel as though they're buying a battery that is really worth what they're paying for in the way of the car.
I mean, that's it, isn't it? It's about the confidence.
Correct.
Whether it has an actual influence on their driving and their driving behaviours, it's giving them the confidence that that used battery electric vehicle has 95% of its health left. What that 95% of health actually means in terms of real world driving varies from car to car, battery to battery. It changes. But it is that perception that I'm buying a used battery electric vehicle that is 95% healthy in terms of its battery and the life I get out of that battery. But thinking about the move from OEMs and manufacturers, the recycling, repurposing of used EV batteries is gaining importance in the future of all of this. We can't continue, as we've alluded to previously, that raw material, the challenges around that raw material, the question about sustainability and efficiency of getting that raw material. So it moves towards that recycling, renewal of battery electric vehicles. That is crucial now for OEMs.
I mean, we're still at very low levels, right? Nobody would deny that the number of vehicles that are coming off at the end of end of their natural life at the moment is very, very small. Okay, so in the way of the manufacturer itself, the first thing for the battery manufacturer is to recycle at the end of the manufacturing process. That's the first stage. Okay, we know that. Then the second stage is, as these cars come through and they're written off or they're damaged or whatever the case may be, is then to take that battery and do something with it. Now the issue here, you've got two things that you could do with it. First thing you could do is take it apart and basically recycle it. Okay, that is quite an energy intensive thing. It's very expensive, and it takes a lot of time. But as time goes on, economies of scale will be gained, the price will come down, and profitability will be made. There's the other one, which is basically you can take the battery and then place that in as battery storage. However, the big issue with that is that at the moment, NMC batteries, nickel, magnesium, cobalt batteries, the scenario with those is they're quite expensive batteries. And ideally, you'd want them back into the car market to give a better return. But at the moment, they can be used for battery storage as well. So it's a combination of two things there, Phil, that you've got to take into consideration at all.
I mean, the dynamic now starting to evolve in the EV battery space. It encompasses a lot of things. We're talking about technology, we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about repairability. And this always has got to drive towards that EV ownership, driving experience for the user at the end of it, but remain profitable and efficient for the OEM and the manufacturer.
Yeah, and I think that's where we've got to look at really carefully is at what point do some of these battery electric vehicles become profitable and when are they not profitable. But what I would say is that the interesting thing about, or the differentiation between internal combustion engines and battery electric vehicles is, the old traditional industrial internal combustion has been around for years, and the gradual improvements over the years have been fantastic. They've been more efficient, less CO2. We've been talking about in our other webinars about emissions from them. They've come down, and they're going to still continue to come down. However, what I would say is with the way of battery technology, it jumps. It moves from NMC battery to solid state battery to aluminium. So there's a lot of different complexities more over and above in this than there will ever be in internal combustion engines.
I mean, you touched on it before, thinking about manufacturer strategies of how they're adopting this going forward. And you touched on battery passports now emerging as an essential tool to tracking that EV origin through its life cycle and through that environmental impact on the sector and in general. Manufacturers are prioritizing this now going forward. How is this now built into OEM strategies, manufacturing of battery electric vehicles, remaining what we talked about previously around the ESG, etc., etc. At the same time as they've got to maintain up-to-date technology, keep up with the latest charging infrastructure, charging speeds, range, and efficiencies, alongside everything else.
So the OEMs going forward have got large levels of investment to take place. Whichever manufacturer you are, you're going to heavily be investing in what we call a battery skateboard, i.e. set of four wheels and a battery that is your chassis, right? You're going to be investing in that. Then you're going to be investing in the next technology and the next chemistry along, and then how you put the whole thing together. So you've got a combination of things. All of that together means you as an OEM have to clearly define and set out your strategy for the long term. How you're going to approach that, what the cost is going to be, i.e. the investment cost, and at the end of the day, what is your end goal, which has got to be, what's the return on investment for my shareholders? And that has to be done in something where the costs are pretty significant at the moment, not just for batteries, but then, of course, we're not talking about this at the moment, but just touch on it is ADAS and LiDAS, which is another factor on top of that.
We're going through it another time, but I think
another time we could do that, but it's all cost. That's
right at the start of this, we alluded to insurance when we're talking about repair, replacement, renewal of batteries, and recycling of batteries. We know that recently, in headlines, John Lewis was named as a consumer brand that pulled out of insuring the EV market for the minute. Now, John Lewis may not be one of the leading top 10 comparison insurance, but it's a leading brand in terms of the consumer space. As we move through, we talk about the complexities, replacement of battery electric vehicles. Is this a key factor now around the ownership, affordability of battery electric vehicles, is getting it into that insurance space, the confidence into the insurance space?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point. I mean, at the moment, what we're hearing in the market, as you said, John Lewis is one. We've heard of a number of other insurance companies that are really looking into this area quite intense. Why are they doing it? Is, I suppose, is the big question. Well, the reason being is because some people say, some people don't say. Personally, I think EV batteries can be quite dangerous if there's a thing called thermal runaway, which we won't go into too much depth. But basically, the scenario there is that what happens is it takes an intense amount of time for the vehicle to be extinguished and the battery to be extinguished. It can be up to 48 hours for the battery to be extinguished in BEV, for example. Okay, and really, in some aspects, can only be just dropped in a vat of water to fully put it out. Whilst the internal combustion engine clearly is much easier to do. You just extinguish it with a fire truck. So the scenario there is, I think the insurance companies are starting to look at this and starting to say, well, actually, what's my risk on this as well? So we're now starting to look at the whole supply chain, which we've commented on many times already. We're now also looking at the downstream, the dealer, etc. But now we're also looking at factors that are outside of that control, which is basically insurance companies and other companies that are actually attached to the battery electric vehicle as well, which also need to be considered.
I mean, this is it, isn't it? There's a lot of initiatives underway around that improvement of the EV battery in terms of its repairability, replacement, renewal. We know that in terms of businesses involved with doing that, so that the insurance companies have the confidence that if there is an issue with the vehicle, either in terms of battery degradation, it needs replacing, or if it has been involved with a collision or there's an insurance claim on it, the costs of replacement or repair isn't expensive. It doesn't affect the insurance policy and the claims in that place. So I think, again, as battery development improves, as the cost of a battery reduces because of productivity and efficiency, because this is about throughput or volume.
Yep.
As we move through time, move towards the deadlines, move towards a more dominated marketplace for the battery electric vehicle in terms of volume, by default, that starts to bring down costs along with manufacturers working on cost efficiencies.
Yeah, like most things, when they come to the norm, which is what it will be, the costs will come down. And I think, fundamentally, it's going to come down, as we've discussed before, it's going to come down in the chemistry. Lithium phosphate batteries are 20% cheaper than NMC batteries. It's going to be down how you manufacture the battery and become more efficient, like you do become manufacturing anything, and then how you actually manufacture the EV, that's going to become more efficient. So bringing all of that cost down enables you to then bring down the insurance if the underlying battery is also safe as well. So combine that all together, insurance costs we don't know yet, may go up, but they also may come down as the battery costs come down and the EV value comes down.
So clearly, I mean, talk about the insurance sector and the challenges, it's addressing those insurance challenges through that sort of integration and long-term affordability of the battery electric vehicle, and particularly the battery electric, the battery within that vehicle.
Correct. And so, for example, you could have, let's say, for example, a solid-state battery, which is what we've discussed before, again in the previous ones that we've been on our webinars. The scenario there is that doesn't have thermal runaway, or has very limited levels of thermal runaway, depending on the type of battery. So, once you get to that state, the battery becomes more safe, and that's when you'll have less concern over the insurance on the actual battery itself.
I mean, again, thanks, Owen. I mean, there's a lot to get through there, and it's a big subject. And I mean, clearly, when we're talking about sustainability and the future of EVs, it's evolving all the time. So, I mean, hopefully, we've covered and managed to touch on quite a few points there in that one. But there's clearly a lot more within the Insight report for the audience to get involved with. Well, thanks again for tuning in to the second in the series of the podcasts. Please check out the Insight report on the Cox Automotive website and stay tuned for the third in the podcast series.